So, Ed, you had something you wanted to start with?
If you don't mind, because it was relatively early in this section, Spinoza was talking about essence versus existence, and if I remember correctly, uh, the existentialists made a point of making a distinction between those two, and I don't understand what he's saying about essence and existence and which one, if one's primary over the other. And I didn't know if any of you had an easy time with this and feel comfortable talking about it.
Do you have a particular, I feel like I ought to be able to turn to it, but do you have a particular proposition in mind?
Well, it was on page, in my notes that I wrote to myself, it was page 18.
Yeah, I think it's P24.
And it was P24.
Okay. I have a different edition.
The essence of things produced by God does not involve existence.
Okay.
And I thought, what? Just to me, my barefoot understanding of the words essence and existence, I would think if God produced something that had an essence, it would exist. It would have an existence. And that's why I wanted to throw it to all of you.
I'm going to actually kind of make further compound this problem of misunderstanding, because I agree with Ed completely. This is a big question mark for me, and I want to sharpen the spear of attack here by saying that I thought it was very strange, right in line with Ed, right? That he says the essence of things produced by God doesn't involve existence. And by the way, Ed, in response to one thing you said also, you would think that the things he makes have existence, right? But I think he's saying, yeah, they exist, but they're these modes of attributes, but not necessarily these things with existence in their essence. But then that leaves me with some questions still. If that's the provisional answer for that far, my question then is that he goes on to say God's existence and the existence of things. Well, God is the efficient cause not only of the existence of things, but also of their essence. And the essence of things produced by God does not involve existence, right? My confusion comes from the next section on contingency. He has this thing that's nothing is right after this. He said, and P29 on the next page for us on page 20. In nature, there is nothing contingent, but all things have been determined from the necessity of the divine nature to exist and produce an effect in a certain way. And so my thing is it sounds like a contradiction at face, from my simple sort of childish reading. You say the essence of things produced by God doesn't involve existence, right? And therefore, by the way, and this is an old scholastic argument, which is what Eric was talking about in the chat, is God's existence different from the existence of things? So it's like I have existence. I listen to a podcast where I got to use this example. The ice cream man, the nice man who drives the ice cream truck, he has existence too. And then I buy some ice cream from him, and then I have ice cream, and he also has ice cream, but he doles it out. But then he's like, well, it's not about the difference between me and God is not between me and the ice cream man, it's between me and a banana split. And it would be weird to say that a banana split has ice cream, that it maybe is existence, that there's some sort of qualitative, severe, sharp distinction between God's existence and ours. But then furthermore, nothing is contingent. If the existent things in the universe, the modes of these attributes have no essential existence, but nonetheless are necessary and are not contingent, what is pure absolute necessity and non-contingency but to have an essentially necessary characteristic that would make them involve some sort of existence in their essence? You see what I'm saying? I don't know. I'm talking, like Spinoza now. That's a problem.
So I think the big thing here is that attributes and essence are extremely similar, or if not the same thing. I'm not going to go that far. We'll just say extremely similar for my lack of not being a Spinoza expert, but I'm pretty confident they're basically the same thing. Something I put in my notes, for example, is that the attribute that one substance expresses via its mode is its essence, right? So when we're talking about, you made the distinction between modes earlier. So when substance is being used, we have these two categories of substance. We have the substance, which is all substance and describing what substance is. And then we have particular instances of substance. And it seems to be the case that unless you're referring to God, which has infinite attributes, which is something I'm going to get to later, which therefore has infinite essence, it has all of the essences as well. Your these particular modes, which are the unique expressions of a particular substance, are going to have unique attributes, and those attributes are reflections of unique essence. So they're basically the same thing. What's important about that is that I brought this up a little bit last time, and I've kind of like really convinced myself into using this expression. So maybe if someone wants to fight me on it, but existence of the existence of substance is axiomatic to substance, meaning you're not going to find a justification for existence anywhere in substance. It exists. That seems to be what Spinoza is saying here. And what he's trying to get at by this whole existence relating to essence is that nothing about any of the essences and thus attributes are going to inform you about the existence of a thing other than it has them, right? Like the only thing you're going to get from it is like, okay, well, I'm experiencing this thing, so it must exist. It's not that the attribute is relaying existence. It's more like the other way around. It's more like you're inferring the existence from the attribute. That's what I took from it, at least. So there is no existence attribute. There's no like redness does not, I don't want to use redness because that's not very accurate here. I just want to stick to the terms he's using. But the attribute does not directly confer existence. Existence is something you pick up from that. And that's, never mind. I've said enough. It makes sense in my head, at least. Maybe. I don't know.
I think that makes sense. So God or substance or nature is what its existence implies essence. So that's the only thing that clearly, you can't think of this thing. Or wait, I think I got that backwards.
The essence implies existence.
Its essence implies existence. So that's different from modes. They're going to have an essence that is contained within the attribute, but it doesn't necessarily exist. That's going to come from, so there's a distinction between modal existence and modal essence. So modal essence, you can think of that as those are all these what makes everything distinct as kind of like eternal laws of motion and rest and whatnot. But then what actually causes that to come into existence, that's going to be kind of on like a different sort of horizontal level of just modes interacting with other modes. And that's going to come from kind of like external causal relations, so that you have one mode kind of collides with another mode, but they're made up of parts. The way that parts move around and eventually form into a relation that is a distinct thing, a distinct mode that will correspond with an essence. So the essence is kind of like what it is as a relation. But then that's itself is contained, has external parts, a multitude of external parts, and it's that comes into existence, but only through other external existing modes interacting with it. So that's how so there's this kind of, he talks about the difference between this kind of there seems to be kind of like two different forms of causality, and that you'll say, okay, there's kind of like a immediate production of things that follows from the definition of God. So you've got, God, substance, what immediately follows from this, absolute infinity is then this expression through its attributes. And then that goes, and you kind of got this whole kind of descending thing. And you can understand that as a kind of like immediate cause. But then also there's the understanding of something's cause as caused by this kind of like infinite chain of existing modes. So that, why did I do anything? Why do we do anything? To understand through its cause, okay, well, I can explain it through, okay, why am I here? I don't know, to talk about Spinoza or something. Then you go back, okay, why am I doing this? Why am I doing that? So what he's saying is that though that kind of modal existence kind of causally interacting on that way, it leads to a kind of infinite chain that eventually will contain absolutely everything in existence. And that's where it kind of actually matches up with the other kind of causality, which more has to do with the essential aspect in the sense of following from definitions and this idea of like a kind of eternal truth. So there's kind of like this eternal truth of essences that have their own kind of existence, but it's not the same as a modal existence, which will realize that essence once it comes into existence from being caused by other modal existences. That's probably really confusing, but oh well, Spinoza's confusing, so yeah, tough.
I guess I'm still okay. I guess I have two questions then. One is like, there are multiple essences then, and some of them don't involve existence. Right, that's one thing. I'm just a checkpoint in my mind. There are multiple existences. There are many infinite essences, I suppose, maybe, and not all of them include existence as a necessary part of themselves. But at the same time, all of those essential things necessarily exist. But so there's a difference between necessity of existence and essential existence. Then what's the distinction there? Because I feel like the definition of something being essential is that it's necessary for you know what I'm saying? Is this a comprehensible question, or am I like keeping us in like first grade here? Like,
I think I understand. So if you say, so like if an essence involves existence, for example, God, then that means the being necessarily exists because part of its essence is actually to be. And so I'm assuming Spinoza is following the scholastic tradition that God is the only being that necessarily exists, and so the only being whose essence involves existence. So then these other things, they don't exist. So I can see where I see where your question is, because like the existence of all these modes, their essences do not involve existence, like the essence of God involves existence. On the other hand, they necessarily exist, right? That's the confusion. Yeah. Okay. So I didn't think I was, but now I'm confused too.
Well, they're products of that which exists, necessarily so, right? Like if I really like this like bifurcation of substance. It's helped me a lot. Maybe it's not super accurate if someone wants to correct me on this, but this idea of like the substance, God, the substance, and then like particular instantiations of substance, which would wind up being modes, essentially. Otherwise, there's no reason to cut them up. But like from my reading of Spinoza, he doesn't say this directly, so you're going to have to take this as an interpretation. We can fight over it if we need to, is that it is like the closest we can get to like the essence of existence is like the comprehension of the infinite attributes of God. Like that would basically be the closest we could get, is to be like, oh, it's everything. All of the things that can and be and are is what existence is, basically. So this idea of like in essence expressing existence would seem to kind of like necessarily miss the point of like what existence is for God, the substance, in a way.
I thought some of you were saying that since God, according to Spinoza, is the only, I'm trying to remember the word you all said, necessary thing, then yes, God has an essence and existence, but everything else didn't necessarily need to exist. But then but if that is what was implied, I thought later in this section, Spinoza said something like, well, of course, if something exists, it was created by God, and he knows what he's doing. I mean, in effect, right? God doesn't make mistakes. But then what was also interesting to me in that issue is it's on page 23, the third full paragraph. It implies that what he's saying is God does not have a divine will, which I thought it was very interesting for someone who was so God-centric to say, no, will's not involved here. And he makes 23, third full paragraph. Yeah, because they have been accustomed to attribute another freedom to God, far different from that we have taught, namely an absolute will. But I also have no doubt that if they are willing to reflect on the matter and consider properly the chain of our demonstrations, in the end, they will utterly reject the freedom they now attribute to God, not only as futile, but as a great obstacle to science. And then, nor is it necessary for me to repeat what I said in P117S. So, I mean, am I misunderstanding Spinoza that he's rejecting that God has a will?
Yeah, so the thing about the will is it's kind of confusing. So we never asked a question kind of about this on the Discord, and I wasn't quite sure. So I tried to kind of pay attention to it when I was reading, but then I'm still not sure about it. But he says specifically, although the reason why it's confusing is because he puts this in a hypothetical of if God did have a will as its essence, then this and this and this would follow, basically saying that it's still a mode, and therefore it's something that is, you know, an effect, not a cause of something. So it's not a free will. So that's what he's really attacking, is that concept that God produces things through decrees of a free volition, like a person thinks they do. It's this anthropomorphic idea of God as a big person. That's what he is really attacking. And I think the appendix makes that a little more clear, where some of this kind of, you know, the little more intricate, you know, kind of geometric proof stuff, it's a little bit harder to figure out. But as far as the will, so he says that, you know, if God does have a will that belongs to his essence, then still it would be a mode of the attribute of thought, and therefore it would still it would not be free, it would be determined. Because the only thing that is really free by definition, what definition is that? 8? Yeah. The thing that is called free, which exists solely by the necessity of its own nature, and of which the action is determined by itself alone. And yes, I do have the definitions on my wall in front of me. Yeah, so that hypothetical of, okay, if God does have a will like this, then it's still a determined thing. But then he basically says in another place outside of this hypothetical that no, the will is not a part of God's essence. At least it's, you know, it's not an attribute or anything like that, but it does seem to be some kind of like special mode that I think is especially because he says that it's kind of like equivalent with an intellect. So whether that would kind of correspond to, there's kind of these different levels of modes that, not to make it even more confusing, but I mean, this is what Spinoza says. And then, so Spinoza scholars, they usually call these, they have a name for these. Okay, so you've got substance expresses itself in infinite attributes. The attributes, a modification of the attributes occurs, and that leads towards an immediate infinite mode. And then that leads towards a mediate infinite mode. And then that leads towards these finite modes. So I think the will could possibly be that infinite immediate mode, which then would make what I said to Nevid in the Discord incorrect, possibly. Except the fact that the laws of, so there's the question of if God's will could be the laws of nature. So I don't think that could be the case, just because those would correspond with different attributes, where the laws of nature, in the sense of like physics, that would belong to the attribute of extension, where the will would be the attribute of thought. But I'm not sure about that. But that is my very long answer to that.
It would almost seem like the laws of God would be a layer deeper than that, right? Like being the infinite attributes, like it's basically what Spinoza's laying out in his book, right? Like those would be the laws of God rather than the laws of nature, because the laws of nature would just be a function of the substance God.
Well, but then in the current, in the real picture, not in the hypothetical, la la land that he's saying these other theologians are caught in, where they think that things are just functions of God, but not they're, us enlightened Spinozas know that better than that. It feels like the thing that would be the things being a function of God. I thought that's what was happening here, and I was slowly coming to terms with that, despite my chagrin. I was like, because the God or nature, right? God is in, everything's immanent to, God is in and everything's in God. And therefore the things that exist are not functions of God. That's why those other theologians who think that things are functions of God are so, we could poo-poo them all day. But this distinction between modal existence as necessary but not essential, which then differentiates the existence of things from the existence of God, or the kind of existence of things from the kind of existence of God, and the kind of essence of things from the kind of essence of God, that sort of distinction seems to be sort of a functional one. Well, yeah, I don't know though. I don't know if these are even criticisms. There's a part of me that feels that, and then the other part is like, I'm trying.
One picky point, maybe is picky. I don't think you want to say things are in God, because then that becomes panentheism. So if the way I think of the distinction in panentheism, God and nature are I don't know if coextensive, I guess coextensive, but they're not identical. So that if you eliminated the natural world, there would still be something there. There would still be God. So you could say things are in God, or that God is in things, which, that the sort of immanentism of that sort, but that the two are not they're not the same. Again, so you could eliminate one without eliminating the other, or you could separate them. But Chase can correct me if I'm wrong, but Spinoza is a strict pantheist, where God and nature are not distinct substances. They are identical substances. So that's one one difference between a thoroughgoing pantheist like Spinoza and some kind of immanentism or pantheism where the two are distinguishable. I don't think for Spinoza they are. Although, like you said, you can't, you can make distinctions, but like, and I can't remember where he said this because I've been reading ahead. Maybe he says it in the stuff, I think he says it in the section we're in. But, what and I think actually Chase said this, what we experience as things are really modes of is it attributes? I get the vocabulary confused. So you've got these attributes of God, and there's an infinite number of them. And then these attributes have these different modes or affections. And that's what we experience as individual things, are these different modes of the attributes. And I think, the question you were asking about essence and so on is related to that. And, I think Eric had I don't know that I can say it without just reading it, but, you can talk about the essence of a kind of thing, which I guess I don't know if a kind of thing would be an attribute, like humanity. I don't know, but you can talk about the essence of a kind of thing, but it's not the same kind. It's not the same. He's got this degrees of reality, this degrees of existence thing going on, like Descartes does, and so the essence of material things is a sort of, I want to say, kind of attenuated essence, whereas for God has this necessary essence that expresses the full reality of everything that is, whereas the essence of some kind of mode is really just the common attributes characteristic of that kind of thing. So you can talk about it having an essence, but it's not this full, this full ontological essence of God kind of a thing. So I don't know if I've explained that badly, Chase.
Nevitt, is okay if I say something, Chase? Nevitt, when you were talking, it reminded me. I also wrote down just a little at the very top of page 23, the first full paragraph. Maybe it's getting to the point that what Spinoza is trying to remind us is very simply, human beings don't know everything. And don't pretend that you do, because if you pretend you know everything, you don't, which means you're going to be making mistakes in terms of the understanding you have of the universe and God. And in that paragraph, the first full paragraph, he says, but a thing is called contingent only because of a defect of our knowledge. For if we do not know that the thing's essence involves a contradiction, or if we do know very well that its essence does not involve a contradiction, and nevertheless can affirm nothing certainly about its existence, because the order of causes is hidden from us, it can never seem to us either necessary or impossible. So we call it contingent or possible.
And my advisor years ago made this distinction between epistemic contingency and ontological contingency. And so I think, there is no ontological contingency, I think, for Spinoza, so that things are necessarily what they are, but there's epistemic contingency, like you said, in the sense that we don't know everything. And so to us, things appear to be contingent. So, for example, a really concrete example, if the universe is deterministic, forgetting about Spinoza for a moment, if the universe is physically deterministic, if the laws of physics exhaustively determine everything that happens, well, if that were the case, if you had a computer big enough and you could collect sufficient data, you could calculate the exact path of every hurricane, the velocity of every bit of wind in it, and so on, perfectly, if you had exhaustive data and infinite computing capacity. But we don't. And so even though, a determinist will say that hurricane is ontologically determined, it's going to do what it's going to do based on the laws of physics. Because we're, like you said, we have limited intellects, it appears to be contingent to us because we don't know what it's going to do, because we're not omniscient. So, yes, I think something like that's going on there.
Okay, thanks. Can I bring up another point? I don't want to, if somebody else has something to say, I don't want to jump in because you all are really helping me understand this.
I at some point would like to hear what Chase means when when Hunter and I have been working on this distinction between these two forms of necessity. And if I understand what Chase is saying, you're saying that there's not any difference. Like there's not any difference between the essence necessarily including existence and things necessarily existing. You're saying there's no difference between those two. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. Everything that exists.
We can't hear you.
Yeah, you sound like you're an echo, Chase. I don't know why. And it goes in and out. Like you'll be talking, and then halfway through your talking, it'll sound normal, and then you're back to like an echo chamber.
Might be like noise cancellation or something.
Yeah, one second. Let me work on that.
Oh, you're back. Oh.
But
Can you hear me?
yeah.
Okay.
And also to ask, similar to what Nevitt said, because it seems that he breaks causality down in almost a couple different categories. Like there's the causality that we have in specific circumstances that we seem to understand and can pinpoint. And then there's a causality that he seems to say that is just effects of the eternal, almost like the infinite. So they are one and the same, I guess, but there's like two different modes of causality for him that seem to be pointing to a system of thought where we can kind of like understand nature or understand some of the effects of the eternal, but also understand the causality of specific circumstances.
Yeah, I think so. So I'm not sure exactly what the terms he uses are, except I think proximate cause I remember seeing as something like I think that's the idea that this is what follows from God's definition kind of immediately. And then there's kind of the more kind of tangential route you can take through other modes, acting on other modes. But what he ultimately wants to say is that those two add up, because if you take all those things combined together, all these little existing modes bouncing around, that ultimately equates to this infinite immediate mode, which does follow from the definition of God. Immediately, it's produced immediately from God by the fact that he's a substance and he exists. His essence is existence, so naturally he has to express himself and his infinite power in these attributes. And the attributes, well, you don't have existence just in an attribute, you exist through a mode, a modification of an attribute. So these things follow necessarily, and that's kind of that vertical dimension, but where it's following from definitions is kind of the way I see it, at least. But the thing is, that ultimately gives you these kind of infinite immediate modes, which is the totality of all of whatever an attribute we take to be. So the attribute of extension, all of that all together, the essence of things produced by God does not involve existence. Yeah, that's the same thing. That's the modal essences. So that's the same. Okay, so existence there, what doesn't involve existence with the essence of modes is only their modal existence, but still you do have a kind of existence that corresponds specifically to the essences of modes, and that exists within the attribute, as which is contained kind of comprised in all the attributes. So the attribute anytime it's modified, the essences kind of produce, they work all in one together as like one. So an attribute you can see as like a quality. It's a one big quality, but there's kind of like degrees of tension within it, and those get expressed. How a certain mode gets expressed is with this kind of a difference of, you know, emphasis within the whole attribute. So that's how these essences, the modal essences, that's how they exist and how they still work in some way together, but they don't exist in as a kind of like an explication within existence. That's something that requires further determination. But seeing that those two, they have different existences, but ultimately they're all necessary in the fact that they follow from God. So in that sense, they are things that do exist necessarily by virtue of their cause and the fact that they follow from God's nature. So it all adds up in the end to necessary existence for what it does exist indeed, as it exists. So
No, that darn it, that you had me, and then you lost me because, and I'll tell you where and why. Because you had me. God and nature are identical, right? I was like, okay, whatever. You said their modal existence is distinct from a modal existence is distinct, right, conceptually, from the existence of modes or of a mode. And so what I thought the answer was their modal existence is not necessary or essential, but the existence of modes is necessary and essential. But then you made the qualifying statement that shocked and appalled the world, which was that it's necessary for things to exist as they exist, which would mean that their modal existence is necessary, right? And not just the existence of the mode.
Their modal existence might be necessary insofar as they are modes of attributes of God, but that doesn't mean that what I was trying to say in the chat, that doesn't mean their existence as the kinds of things they are involve existence. So I don't know. I mean, again, I'm having a hard time figuring out what exactly is an attribute versus a mode. But if you have some kind of thing that has an essence, and it's not God, then the essence of that thing does not entail its own existence. It doesn't exist necessarily by its own nature as that kind of thing, which is what the essence is. What kind of thing is this? It's a horse thing or a human thing. And the essence of that thing does not involve its necessary existence. Nevertheless, as a mode of God, it necessarily exists as a mode of God, not in its own right, but as a mode of God. So it's the distinction about the nature of the thing as it is in itself, which is contingent, versus the nature of the thing as a mode of God, which is necessary. And, you know, he keeps making these distinctions all throughout about, well, if you look at it from God's perspective, this is the way it looks. If you look at it from the contingent world, this is the way it looks.
Yes. I think that's exactly it. Go, Hunter. I see you got the pen up. Go for it.
Because I'm not even. I like, you know, Eric, whenever he and I were in dialogue classes, whenever somebody said something he agreed with or rejoiced in, he would kind of knock on the table like British parliamentary, you know, yeah, heads of state, yeah, being like, oh yeah, I agree, yeah, rah, rah. Yeah, rabble.
Earlier today with where is he? Is he Christopher Hall. I was talking to him earlier today. We're talking about the Zoom, and the guy mentioned nuclear disarmament, and I was like, the only guy in the room.
I'm chanting in support like a football fanatic. The thing in itself does not involve existence. If the thing in itself is even a coherent term, which it's not here, which is why Spinoza doesn't say this. Spinoza doesn't put it like this. But if I had to, kind of mangle it for my own difficulties it would be that the thing in itself does not involve existence, but the thing as mode of God necessarily exists. Yes, okay, I can think that. I think that makes sense. I don't know, I might there might still be some, I feel like there's some part of my brain that's like, no, don't let them do that to you, it's still nonsense, I don't know.
This may be a bad analogy, so I apologize if this is more confusing. But if you think about like a wave on the ocean, you could talk about what the essence of a wave is. You could literally define what it means to be a wave, in terms of fluid flow and stuff. But even so, a wave is really a mode of the ocean. And so you could talk about the essence of a wave in the sense that it has a definition, but really the wave doesn't have any existence independently of the ocean. So I'm not sure that's a perfect analogy, but that's something that popped into my mind.
And it's entirely possible for waves to not exist if the ocean is calm, right? It's not of the essence of the wave that it exists.
I actually really like that. That's good. Another raw. Yes. You were talking just a second. I don't know if we're done here. Actually, I should probably wait, see if anybody else had any other thoughts there, but it seemed like, okay. You were talking for a second about like the relationship between kind of like attributes and modes and essences. And I actually, for me, when I was going through this and writing all my notes down, I've got like a notepad document here that's gone way, I got to scroll up and down through this thing now, but it actually helped me the most when I work backwards. And this is something that I wanted to talk to you guys about, because I think the relationship between modes, attributes, and essences is extremely important to all of this. And so when you work backwards, I'm just going to I won't read it word for word because it would take way too long. But so I have modes are the result of like a particular instance of a substance expressing particular attributes. So this is to contrast it from God, the substance, which is all attributes, infinite, right? These modes are finite and express finite attributes. And it's through these finite attributes that the substance is modified into, like we would say, like a human body, right? So the human body is a mode, a particular piece of the singular substance God that expresses particular attributes, which give it its shape, what it's made out of, what all it has, etc. Attributes are infinite, but not in modes, I'm pretty sure. I think in God they're infinite, but maybe I misread that. Sorry, that was addressing a comment. And so where was I going with this? If basically like that to me made the most sense as far as how to put it all together, because then you relate attributes back to essences through the modes themselves, where it's like modes, you're looking for what is like the necessary thing in and of itself for that particular thing. And this is where I get to the point where I think attributes and essences have a lot less difference than it seems on face value. But I don't know if we were disagreeing there, Chase, but maybe you could correct me. Like, it seems to be the case that modes don't have infinite attributes. They necessarily have finite attributes, but God, the substance, has infinite attributes.
Yeah, that's okay. So God as substance has infinite attributes. A mode is always a mode of a certain attribute.
Yeah, the expression of the divine will. Yeah.
Or not the will.
Oh, sorry, divine essence. My bad. Sorry. Mixing up my biblical whatever.
I knew what you meant.
Yeah. The expression of the divine essence. Yeah, because all you're doing is you're pulling an attribute from God and instantiating it, rather than being like some unique special existing in yourself snowflake of an attribute, right?
Yeah, yes. And so the attribute, okay, so expression also works, the way that kind of this how so God is, its essence is its power of what? Of causing itself, which is also what? Of expressing itself. What does that mean? So that's to kind of modify itself into this kind of, distinction of itself. And that's how you get all these, levels in a sense. But okay, where does kind of infinity go from here? But I think the thing is that kind of power or of expression or cause of itself, that works through this relation of infinities as well, so that a kind of an infinite thing, it necessarily has to express itself through another kind of infinity. So you've got this absolute infinity of God, which is complete, it's absolute. There's no kind of limitations. So then from there, you've got an attribute. An attribute also is infinite, but in what way? In its kind. And I think that has to do with the fact that, okay, the way you can see these attributes is that they're qualities. So it's almost like you can see it as, okay, this is just a example, obviously, but think of it as like different colors. So you can see like, okay, white, yellow, green, whatever. It's a color, but it's got kind of degrees of different, colorness, within the whole quality. So an attribute is like a continuum of all these degrees of the quality. But the thing is, for it to have any kind of a specific kind of, oh, it's that, shade of green, it's that shade of white, whatever, it has to kind of work with every other color at the same time. And that's why all the essences are involved with anything to do with that attribute. So anytime that attribute is expressed, it's working in this way where you've got kind of a relation of explication, which is, what is going to exist in the attribute, what corresponds to that. But then you have a whole bunch of implication going on, which that's going to be all the rest of these degrees of this attribute or this quality that don't exist necessarily. I need to stop saying necessarily in a casual way, but those. So okay, I think even the thinking of like the wave and the ocean, that's definitely a good way of trying to visualize what is going on. So, and I think generally that's kind of like the whole, it's the same basic kind of logic, I think, operating on multiple levels through multiple things with Spinoza. And I think it follows along that way of thinking of, the ocean and the wave. If you can think in terms of those, you can see how that kind of basic logical maneuver is repeated throughout on multiple levels. At least that helps me try to think of it exactly. If I'm thinking of it exactly at all. Yeah.
I cut Ed off a long time ago, and I apologize. And I was wondering if Ed wanted to bring back up whatever you were going to talk about.
No, that's fine, and really don't. Everything's fine of it. I'm glad you did, because then there was this whole flow of conversation that wouldn't have happened if you hadn't. So everything's fine. And this is sideways anyway. It's on page 24 and 25. I really thought that was a really weird phrasing of Spinoza, where he here we go. It's at the very bottom of page 24, and then at the top of page 25. I confess that this opinion, which subjects all things to a certain indifferent will of God. You know, I've never heard of the word indifferent put in front of word of God. It's like, wait a second, it's a apathetic agitation. I mean, you know, it doesn't well, how can the will of God be indifferent? But then I thought it was really interesting the way he was explaining it. And he says, and makes all things depend on his good pleasure, is nearer the truth than that of those who maintain that God does all things for the sake of the good. For they seem to place something outside God, which does not depend on God, to which God attends as a model in what he does, and at which he aims as at a certain goal. This is simply to subject God to fate. I was just wondering what you all thought about that. I just thought that was like, wow. I had never had someone separate kind of like the march of God on earth, you know, God's will to you know that phrase, Nevin, I'm sure you've heard it. Somebody may have meant something for evil, but God can turn it into something good, you know, like the story of Joseph in the Old Testament and things like that. But what Spinoza is saying, he rejects that. I mean, to me, in this paragraph, he's rejecting that reading. And I was wondering what you all thought of that.
I mean, it's like Eric said, it's the Euthyphro dilemma. You know, the man certainly read up on his classics, right? I mean, personally, to me, it's a super compelling argument, right? Like either God is just making up the rules as he goes, or there's something outside of God that is where he gets his good from, in which case he isn't, you know, one of your favorite Thomistic qualities of God, right? Whichever one you want to knock down on the particular conversation. But this just is bringing me back to my chat little joke that I made earlier, where it's like Spinoza he's got all of the atheist trimmings. He just keeps using this God language all of the time. I'm not convinced. I'm not even convinced about the pantheism thing anymore. I think he's just didn't have the vocabulary or something to just talk about it in a secular way.
That's interesting, Christian, because I go into this reading fully aware that Spinoza was charged with atheism, and I'm still thinking he had a keener idea of God than the Christians. You know, he was more devoted to the notion of God and pursued it and came up with clearer ideas than the contemporary Christians.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, I'll agree with that too, but that's my Reddit atheism showing, right? You know, but
this is a bit of a non sequitur, but Spinoza wrote this book called Theological Political Treatise, and in it you can really see his relationship with God as something actually existing, and it's very keen and smart and promotes religious freedom. And yeah, that's Spinoza. Alrighty then, I'm gone now.
Yeah, here's what I'll say. From his metaphysics, you know, maybe he had all sorts of like personal beliefs outside of, but from his metaphysical foundations, he leaves no room for any conception of a God. I would separate from a cool breeze, you know, like, I mean, that's all I'll say. Sorry, this is kind of off topic. I know but the Euthyphro dilemma, yeah, I caught on that as well. That was very cool that he kind of like rounded back up on that thing and rope, not only that, but he was able to rope it in with the broader conversation of how his God functions. So he's like basically saying, I've solved the Euthyphro dilemma for you. You're welcome, you know?
Yeah, so I think I definitely like what Eric said about Spinoza's God, as that he understood the concept on an essential level much better than the Christians. Or I think maybe a better way to phrase it is that he took there's this idea of God, which the appendix, I think, in this part one is amazing. It's kind of like a genealogy of kind of these ideas, and the way he explains how kind of these ideas of final causes and anthropomorphic gods work. I think that the fact that was written 350 years ago, I think, is quite extraordinary. But I think you see there kind of where he's coming from, but in the sense of what he's really critiquing, especially. But then if you then compare that to, the kind of positive things that he's asserting, I think you then kind of get the idea of what he is talking about, in the sense that, okay, he took kind of these essential aspects of this idea of God, as so his definition of God is supposed to be something that any probably within his expected readership in 17th century Europe would have educated people, whatnot, that they would have agreed with that. And that would include basically kind of Christians along the board, probably Orthodox Jews and whatnot too, Cartesians, kind of various forms of deism, possibly, I don't know. But that idea of just kind of an infinite substance that is cause of itself, it's independent, and that has, infinite power, these kind of things, I think he took that and showed what happens when you take that seriously. And what happens is you can no longer have all the kind of superficial anthropomorphic things that people also add to it. And that's what he showed so amazingly. I don't know how else to explain it. And yeah, I think he definitely believes in this God that he's talking about, and he believes that it is God, and that other people just have God completely wrong by adding all these things in it. But that ultimately, when it comes down to it, they're trying to come to that idea of God that he has.
Yeah, I agree, Chase. I mean, by analogy, and I guess, Christian, I'm sorry you missed Monday, because I really wanted to give you positive, a leg up for the reading on Monday, but I'm going to have to disagree with you again. For me, just to paint the picture, right? If you can imagine Spinoza saying, to people around him, you guys imagine God as this man with this huge beard up there in the clouds. Well, guess what? That's entirely wrong. And everybody calls him an atheist because he says such a thing. And we look at it retroactively and say, no, he had a better vision of God. With this picture I've just painted, it seems a little strange for me to hear you say, no, he was like a crypto atheist, and him telling everybody that God is not this big guy with the beard and the clouds up there. He was actually trying to be an atheist and dispel the whole notion of God altogether.
I don't think there's a meaningful distinction between the two things that we're saying. I think I totally see where you're coming from, but I think it's just a different spin on the same story. Like, it's a narrative difference more than it is like a fundamental difference. Like, this, as far as I am concerned, is a secular text, at least in the metaphysics. There's nothing in here that requires me to have any. I can just replace the word God with universe, and it all follows. Every single bit of it follows. It follows in the exact same way, from the same premises, with the same argument, and it carries none of the meaningful connotations of God before. So if we just want to reify the word God into universe, that's fine as well. And I agree, it is a more coherent understanding than anything else anybody was offering. To me, it seems more like a narrative dressing than like a meaningful disagreement between us. But
I'll say another one. Like, there's a part in here that really reads like Anselm's ontological proof, and to me, like, to reproduce that while being an atheist seems rather superfluous. Like, you could say a lot of the same things without all this explicit reference to God. I anticipate a point where you could say, well, he's using God for the sake of his audience, and that if he was more more integrity in his message, and he really was a closet atheist, then he could say all of these things by just saying nature, the universe, and not using God at all. But he only tactically chose to use God because of his wider audience. I'm not convinced of that myself. I think he uses God because he genuinely believes that God is identical with nature and the universe, and that is not an atheistic position at the end of the day, but rather a pantheist position. So, like, for me, pantheism is not atheism.
To follow, I think, on what you said, Eric, is Christian, imagine that you are going to try to come up with a vocabulary to describe God that in no way betrays any anthropomorphism. You can't say father. Think of certain words you can't use. And you're going to try to describe God and the, for lack of a term, capability of God. What are you going to do?
Use a different word.
No, well, no, but I'm saying is,
I know, I get what you're
saying. But that's what I'm trying to say to you. Grant, for the sake of argument, that this question, and because I am being sincere when I ask you this question, that if you're actually trying to do this, you're trying to make a theistic argument without in any way using anthropomorphic vocabulary, symbolism, all the things we're aware of from the Judeo-Christian tradition, right? Or even, Greco-Roman, the pantheistic, right? I mean, if their gods weren't humanist, in a way human, whose word, all right? You abolish all of that. What kind of language are you going to use?
German, Geist.
Yeah, I mean, non-anthropomorphic. I mean, I don't know. I've never been put in a position where I've been asked this question, but
that's what Spinoza, I think, was faced with.
What? Okay, so, I mean, he could have called him, I don't know, the sun. Like, that's not anthropomorphic, or the moon in Taurus 5 or something. Or look, I feel like I'm being silly here, but I understand where you guys are coming from. This will just be my hot take, I guess, that I'm not convinced that there's like a meaningful connection to God here, but that can just be me, and we can move on. It's not super pertinent to the reading either, based on my own opinion. So,
I agree.
I don't want to take up too much time with it. Sorry.
I'll say in your defense too, I've heard others say, allege that Spinoza, was actually all along something of a crypto-atheist.
Well, and maybe like I said, maybe he had some opinions, some ideas that aren't expressed in the metaphysics, but like this right here, I'm just not saying it. That's all I'm saying. So I won't take up any more time on this line. I'm sorry. I think I already talked about it last time too.
I want to read a comment that Chase made on Discord when I was asking this same basic question. My question was, if a scientist identifies as an atheist and then one day decides to start using the word God instead of nature, does that make him a Spinozist? And one thing Chase said was, nature is interchangeable with God because they designate the same substance, not because someone just decides to rename nature. Spinoza would already object to nature being reduced to a single attribute. If nature is God, then it is a substance with infinite attributes, not one. And so I think, one thing I was thinking of, why, how is this different from just pure atheistic naturalism? And because, his system does include this notion of a divine with infinite attributes, and these attributes have modes, and that whole ontological superstructure, which, maybe you can describe nature in those terms. Maybe you can kind of flip the coin over and say, well, you can interpret that in such a way that it just becomes identical with nature. That's, maybe that's true. But in terms of this ontological description of the structure of reality, I'm wondering if there's something about his ontology that is not reducible to for example, in our contemporary interpretation of physics, not necessarily reducible to atoms in motion or something like that.
Well, yeah, because like on page 20, he says, whatever is in God by P15, but God cannot be called a contingent thing. For P11, he exists necessarily, not contingently. He seems to be making this distinction between thought and causality, and that once you can have certain aspects of causality in a materialist sense in nature, but there seems to be some aspect of thought that connects to God in nature, and that's what he seems to be going after. Like, God is necessarily in nature, and our thoughts are tied to these eternal or infinite concepts in nature, but they are separate from the other circumstances and unique situations of causality that we find in certain points. So it's like we have science and physics and all of these things that like produce certain causalities, and we learn concepts from them. But then he almost seems to be saying there's this ontological structure in thinking itself that is rooted in what he calls the eternal. And I keep thinking of the eternal or the infinite in more of a Hegelian sense. Again, maybe I'm borrowing concepts from previous philosophers. But that seems to be what he's doing. There's a thought, and then there's an extension, or there's a causality. And he's trying to merge those two by breaking the causality into different categories, but saying ultimately, all of those thoughts are rooted in nature, aka God, in almost a stoistic fashion. Again, I don't know what's going on with your mic, but you cut in and out. Again, it might be noise cancellation, as Christian mentioned. You sound fine, fade in, fade out. It's strange.
Yeah, I don't know.
Now you're good.
My input. Okay, nothing. Still.
No, you're great. It's loud.
Okay. That's weird.
Hey, Chase, is the question I ask, is that correct? That let's see. So Hunter says thought and extension are two attributes of the same.
Yeah, like yes, that's what I'm thinking. Like but they're kind of different modes.
Well, I don't know. I've seen places where he says you can look at something this way and it's a thought, and you look at it that way and it's extension, and that it's really the same thing. But I don't. I mean, is it proper vocabulary, Chase, to say that that thought and extension are attributes?
Yes.
It is? Okay.
They're attributes. My screen's not lighting up again. Can you all hear me? Okay. So yeah, they're attributes. So Joseph, I think really the reading for next time will help a lot. Because that will mainly be about this relation between the two attributes, especially in with respect to substance, where it kind of gets into the parallelism, and I think that's what you're kind of asking about. But I think the thing is that so thought and kind of how it relates to extension or physical things, bodies, whatnot. So thought, its object is of a mode of extension. So he says that, for example, our mind is the idea of our body. Its object is to be an idea of our body. So the way those are always coupled together in some aspect. And that's also why there is indeed a kind of ontological structure of thought, in the same way that there's also laws of nature or laws of extensive nature. There's also, and that's what he thinks are the laws of logic. Those correspond also with these laws of extension, motion and rest. movement, physical dynamics, also has a intellectual dynamics as well. So as far as, I'm not exactly sure how that relates to the specific causality that you were referring to, except that he's going to deny that there's any direct causality between different attributes. But indeed, they do have an identity in substance. They have a common identity in substance, and that's ultimately what connects them. Yeah. Hopefully that.
Yeah, like and that is what God is here in a way. So you're saying the next reading is going to be more helpful. Have you read this before?
So my reading of it is kind of okay. So I did exactly what I would advise everyone to not do, which is that I skipped around because I was mainly quote hunting. And so I've read kind of roughly about 2/3 of each part of each of the 5 parts, but there's chunks of every part that I've not read. And what I'm finding going through those chunks that I've not read, I'm like, oh my God, why didn't I read this before? This is so important. And then yeah, I think it should probably just be read indeed in order and all the way through. But instead I was panicking trying to write about Spinoza after just like briefly going through. Yeah, it was just, oh God. Yeah. We're not going to talk about my thesis.
We've all been
lack
there.
thereof.
Next question, Chase. What's coitus? Sorry, conatus.
I need a demonstration. We need a materialism aspect here to talk about the various parts of causality with coitus.
Weren't y'all talking about alien sex in the Discord earlier?
What did I miss out on? Really?
No,
Dang it.
tentacles. It was just tentacles. It doesn't have to be
hentai. That's not alien.
Oh,
Like,
okay.
you need a kids friendly Arutsuka doji or something.
So on the topic of alien sex, I have a movie recommendation. Possession, which I think it was 1978. I don't know. My mind just came up that I have no idea if that's right. But if you've never seen this movie, Possession, it was made by this Polish guy. It's one of the best films ever, in my opinion. Watch it.
I like Communion better than Possession for alien sex.
Yeah, check it out.
Possession was good, but I think Communion was superior. But okay, sorry. Okay.
What would Spinoza think about all this alien
Sorry,
sex?
yes, thank you. Yeah, causality.
No. Like, I'm actually serious. Do you think he'd be for it? How would that affect his idea of God? Just a little goofy, but
Well, maybe if you guys are cool, we can segue into some question marks that I have that kind of have to relate to that exact question, actually, as far as the infinite universe and infinite attributes, unless anybody else has any direction they want to go in. Okay.
So I wouldn't say, just real quick. So Eric, I'm not sure if you were seriously asking about the conatus. In case you were, I'll just say that that's not really a factor until kind of later in part 2. So we can just talk about that. Yeah.
I only raised it because Hunter raised it, and then I wanted to say coitus because it's fun.
That is a fun word. I do like that word.
I kind of just staying on track with the whole alien thing. I kind of want to do these in reverse order from what I had intended, but they both have to relate to some conclusions that Spinoza draws from like the necessity of infinity in this concept of God. And I wrote a couple of these down. I'm not going to read through all of them again. It would take way too long. But basically for this particular one, it's like Spinoza argues that the attributes of God, the substance, must be infinite, necessarily so, else we wouldn't be able to explain all of the things about the universe. Like if we were to put a finite number of attributes onto God, there would be something in the universe that would be left unexplained, or in nature, or in the world, if you would prefer to use those terms. But this assumes that an infinite nature, infinite world, infinite God would have infinitely diverse things. And is there any reason to believe that the world we live in is infinitely diverse as opposed to like really massively, hugely diverse? Because there's a big difference between infinitely diverse and really massively, hugely diverse.
Yeah, but not if you're looking at it from the point of view of an individual human being.
What do you mean?
It's the idea of perspective. We can say that there's a finite number of grains of sand on the planet. I don't think any of us will be able to count them in our lifetime. So in some ways, there's a certain kind of practical infinity. People are discovering new species of insects and lizards, amphibians and reptiles all the time. So, I mean, we don't even know what the bottom of the ocean is really like. And so, I mean, to me, I think we have to be careful about asserting things that human beings know about even the planet that we've been living on for quite a while.
Yeah, I think I'm just doing the reverse, right? It's like, oh, we keep discovering new things, therefore there must be infinitely many things. It's like, do we have any real reason to believe that there must be infinitely many things?
Well, I won't go so far as to say infinite, but look at the advances in physics in the last 20 years or so, where from my reading of it, they've said that if you look at dark matter and dark energy, those two together constitute 97% of the universe. And we really don't know anything about them. So since the beginning of time in human beings, wow, we've now captured 3%. We all have a sense of 3% of the universe. I don't know. It seems like we've learned quite a bit in the last 150 years, and yet now we're looking at something vast, and that's only at 3%. And who knows if we get a handle on dark matter, if that's going to lead to a whole new set of questions and different, physical, I don't want to say entities, but different characteristics or attributes, if I can use those terms, about the universe.
Right. I think though, there's a certain, I think in like an average conversation, I would be like more, I don't know why I said it that way, but like from Spinoza's perspective, trying to make like a rigorous metaphysical foundation that he's going to build everything off of, it seems to me like a leap to say that because there are lots of things and we keep finding new things, that there is an infinite number of things, and therefore we need an infinite number of attributes to be able to explain the infinite number of possible things.
Sure. Well, let me go further. I mean, I'll drop that line of argument because I totally agree with you. There's real big holes in it. Somewhere in these pages that we read for today, I thought Spinoza connected eternity to infinity. And I apologize, I don't know what page it was on, but I should have written it down because it jumped out at me. And again, I think, and this is going back to a point that Eric made about, does Spinoza really believe in the existence of God? If eternity and infinity are in some ways related or connected, then I do think that Spinoza is honestly articulating a position about infinity.
Tristan, I saw you put your hand up for a second. Did you want to say something, bud?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that he does cook up eternity and infinity. And I was gonna ask the question about whether or not I just got my book today. So, and I've also not finished my review yet. So I've been painfully walking through that, and so I've not been focusing on Spinoza as much. But I'm attempting to like fall back into my Spinoza slumber from undergrad. I don't know if I actually think that Spinoza. I think that there's like this idea of like Spinoza trying to find like a definitive ground to build off like the whole like Cartesian kind of project of finding a firm foundation. I don't know. I'm kind of skeptical. I don't know. Like for some reason, I'm kind of skeptical that of thinking like Spinoza is doing something similar, where it's like he's trying to build out like a foundation, or like just to like find a rock of the ages or something to kind of like moor himself to. And I think that like God being impersonal would kind of make that like an impersonal God, like the God that he has here, would make such a project like it would, I don't know, take some of the steam out of it. Is like my recollection incorrect there, that he's not really doing like a first philosophy like Descartes? That he's not meaning to, but insofar as he's doing one, he's like, it's not like because he is setting out to prove that there can be a first philosophy of some kind. He just happens to like stumble into it almost.
I don't know what you mean by stumbles into it. I mean, it seems to me at least that like the fact that you're including like a metaphysical foundation in your book on ethics seems to indicate that you've got some kind of like, you know, big project here that you're trying to codify into this one text that you can kind of go to and be like, it's the Spinoza book, you know. But maybe I don't know, maybe I'm missing something there. But it seems to me the case that he is kind of engaging in the same sort of project as Descartes. Just his end goal is like moving more directly towards the ethics rather than like calling it, you know, the metaphysics of Spinoza or something.
I found the it's P is in Peter 21, bottom of page 16. All the things which follow from the absolute nature of any of God's attributes have always had to exist and be infinite, or are through the same attribute eternal and infinite. And then he talks about that on the and then following pages.
I kind of want to make another remark here. I'm a big style guy. I love how he says here, if you deny this, then conceive if you can. I just love shit like that.
That's good. I don't know. I mean, does anybody else have any other thoughts on the whole, you know, does God have to have, like, let's say everything else we take for granted, right? Up till that point where we talk about God having infinitely many attributes. Like, does it really follow? It seems more like it's a posit that like, hey, it seems to be the case that there's a whole lot of things out there. So we're going to call it infinitely many things. And because of that, we're going to need infinite attributes, right? Because otherwise we could potentially, there could be a system here where it's like, okay, there's a finite number of attributes, and maybe even all of those attributes have a continuum, but that's not what Spinoza seems to be talking about. It's like, we have double infinities here. We have infinite attributes and then a continuum of those attributes to try to explain all of the things that can be and are in the universe.
Yeah, so I think be one way of thinking about it is, so if you look at his idea of substance, so first he kind of just says, you know, okay, substance is this, blah, blah, blah. But he starts by not saying that, you know, there's just one substance, but he gets there eventually. But the arguments he uses to eventually make that kind of show, I think, how he gets also to those ideas that substance, its essence is, you know, power. It's a infinite power or absolute power. So if substance is a cause of itself, it can have nothing external outside of it that limits it or that acts upon it, because then there would be some kind of limitation of it. So I think the fact that it doesn't have that limitation right there, that would be I'm not sure, an argument, I think, for that definition of that it necessarily has to be infinite in some way. And I think if you include that with the fact that this is something that, you know, is completely kind of self-grounding, I mean, it's substance, that with the fact that there's nothing
limiting it that has some quality of the absolute. And he's going to take that and say, okay, yeah, we've got absolute infinity here. So what follows from that? And I think that's kind of where he really starts going, or that's almost kind of like the presupposition, the image of thought that he has that kind of guides him through these things, that, you know, substance can have nothing outside of it limiting it. It's an absolute infinity in that sense, but it's more like an infinity not in a numerical sense, but instead as a kind of productive power. You know, it's almost like infinite energy, infinite power, and only I think later down in the modal realm, you know, logically posterior, then you have diversity. You know, so but what is it that, you know, gives diversity? What is it that allows for the production of diversity? I think that's what he would say. That is that infinite power, but it's an infinity of a different kind that produces, you know, a diversity in that other sense. So I think that kind of unification of substance, and the fact that it can't have, you know, numerical distinction within it, but yet it is some kind of power of self-causation, that gives it a kind of an absolute sense to it, which then leads towards these expressions of these different kinds of infinity. So, you know, whether it's totally axiomatic, I don't really think so. I mean, I don't think philosophy really works that way, but that's kind of a side point. But at least that's probably my best way to try to argue what I think, at least my way of trying to understand Spinoza's argumentation.
To me, I guess what I'm hearing is, you know, the argument on infinite, and maybe just to kind of like back up to Ed's point, which to me, you know, I said in the comments of like, yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me. Like, I feel like I don't have interest in arguing against it. I feel like, I guess, you know, Chase gives this argument, and I'm kind of like, okay, I don't, you know, I guess, you know, and Hunter said it too, of like, he's arguing demonstratively versus descriptively, which to me kind of says like he's arguing maybe just from some sort of logic. And it sounds like this might be tied to his claim that there's only one substance. And the idea being that, like, if we opened it up to the possibility that there's not infinite attributes, that maybe it would poke a hole in his argument of there being only one substance. And so, you know, I guess I wonder, like, what are the consequences if we took infinite attributes away? What would that open up?
Well, it would open us up to the really cool possibility of, you know, assuming we live in this world where let's say there are a countable number of attributes, we could catalog them. That's pretty cool. But Spinoza's, at least the way I read Spinoza, is that his representation is essentially saying like, why would you even bother trying to like find all of the attributes to understand things? Because every time you find one, you're going to find another and another. Other than for the sake of collecting. Say,
like, you know, from that pragmatic point of view, from like, you know, he's building to that ethics, and at least, like, you know, if we would say that that's what we're interested in, I don't know, like from my reading, I read it and I'm just like, okay, I don't know, like what, you know, where's he going with it, I guess is, you know, and I'll accept it right now, I guess, as a way of saying like, I don't think I understand the logical argument enough to argue against it. And you know, it feels like almost like a problem that, I don't know, I guess I don't find it, like, would it make a difference for what Spinoza ends up claiming at the end?
And just to ask directly, Christian, are you looking at this from a finite constructivism point of view as an analytical philosopher?
I mean, a little bit, yeah.
Okay. That's what I thought you were alluding to. So,
well, the question, I mean, regardless, kind of came to my mind is like, hey, he's kind of just asserting here that like, hey, there's going to be infinitely many things, and it's like, is there really? Can we say that? Like, is that good integrity on us to be like, yeah, there probably will be infinitely many things. Therefore, it follows there will be infinitely many attributes.
I see what you're doing. So, but and I know the point you're trying to get across. I just don't have a greater understanding of Spinoza yet to really apply that criticism. But yes, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Well, I think, sorry to butt in right here. This argument about infinity and finite reminds me a lot of Christian theological philosophy dealing with why God is one and why there's not two or three. And I think we can apply the same argument to finite attributes, right? If it's not infinite, I agree with Eric, and it seems like almost everyone in the chat, right? Maybe that having finite attributes would limit God, because if it was finite, there would have to be some explanatory reason why there is that specific number that there is. And this would seemingly be external to God and how we understand God. And right, I mean, that's already loaded, like how we understand God. But if we want God to be this infinite absolute thing, we would need them contained and grounded in and of itself, right? If that makes sense. And so having a finite number of attributes, doesn't that make it so that there's some kind of explanatory reason that God's determined, right? Rather than being the utmost free thing, no?
Well, I was going at it from the opposite end of things, Jackson, but I thank you for bringing that up. I wasn't looking at it so much that if there's finity, there's finiteness, and that means, you know, God is limited, then is he really God? But we do have examples of real infinity. I mean, mathematicians have been talking about different orders of infinity for decades. I don't remember the mathematician who came up with the concept, but there are not all infinities are equal. So,
Yep.
right, and
bigger
so
and smaller infinities. Yeah.
yeah, and so if we have infinities in mathematics, I mean, we just do. And if you accept that the universe is expanding, then what does that suggest about anything that you can not perpetually, sorry, that was a slip, but to potentially count is always increasing.
Right. Well, I don't want to get bogged down too much in like the physics, but if it's expanding, that means there's a border and that it's continuing and that it's not infinite. So there is a cap on the number of things.
But go back to my mathematics example.
Right. And there can be an infinite of some things, but it doesn't mean that everything has to be of infinitely many things. Like in Spinoza's world, there's not just like an infinite number of, there's not just infinity in numbers. There's an infinite number of systems that can produce an infinite number of infinities that can produce an infinite number of situations that we're in right now. Like it's the largest of the big infinities. It's maximal infinity. Sorry.
Well, also Joey's point in the chat.
Well,
go ahead.
No, I mean, I think, and again, where this, at least from my perspective, is this is more of a discussion of what infinity is, because one of the standpoints of finite constructivism is we often confuse infinite and infinitely many with ordinary language when we're asked how many. That's a direct quote from the Foundations and the Lectures of Mathematics of Wittgenstein. And there is a technique associated with it. So we tend to allow this concept of infinity to be kind of translated over into different areas of techniques. It's one of the rebuttals that Wittgenstein had with Turing, and he was arguing this point about infinite numbers of series. So for finite constructivism, there's a limit to it, a technique, as Christian is saying. So that's where it's kind of coming from. It's just, for me right now, I don't have a proper understanding of Spinoza to kind of look at it from an analytical perspective. I'm trying to see it from the perspective of what Spinoza is saying, and certainly want to analyze it. But I think what's happening here is we're trying to take an analytical concept of finite constructivism, and it's kind of it's butting heads with continental philosophy, particularly with this aspect of infinity when it comes to Spinoza. So I don't think we're going to come to a consensus, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think I don't even know if I was really looking for one, just more so like what people's thoughts are. And I appreciate everybody giving them. I know we're kind of back and forthing here, but I like all of this because these are not ways that I've necessarily looked at it before. But it's just more so that like I feel like it's a pretty simple on its face concept as far as like things that we've covered to be like, okay, God is, I almost said he, I don't even like doing that in this situation, but God is of infinite attributes, right? It's like, okay, I get what he's trying to get across there. I'm more interested in whether or not that follows necessarily from how he's trying to set it up. But and I have a similar question as far as like this whole idea of things which are not infinite necessarily are have like are not independent, which I don't know if that's necessarily true either. But I feel like it's probably going to run down the same kind of rabbit hole that we've just been down. So maybe I could save it for another time or something.
Say that again. Say the phrase again.
Things which are infinite are necessarily independent. That's his claim. I don't know if that's provable. I don't know.
My brain was like check mark. Yes, makes sense. Okay.
So I think
Yes.
the provable
absolute
thing.
infinity that would be completely independent.
Well, I just put this in the chat, but on the provability, I feel like I read something, and I don't know like a lot about what kind of demarcates a system as like speculative or not. But I see this word thrown out as something used to describe Spinoza, and I've seen that kind of connected to the idea that there's not necessarily like something we could do that would like prove his system right or even prove it wrong, but it's a speculative system, and then it kind of gives us some axioms, and then we can kind of like choose to act on those if we feel like, and I put that at the end of like, does this increase my power, my perfection? And I guess, maybe that's how it might place him in that kind of ethical realm of more so geared towards practical philosophy. But yeah, I think like the question of like, are there really infinite attributes? And then like, can we prove that wrong? Like, I don't know, and I don't know if like Spinoza or Spinozists would say that that's a kind of like relevant question for him, I guess.
Yeah, I think there's definitely that practical, indeed ethical element that is definitely essential to what I think Spinoza is trying to do here.
Is he is trying to do something that is, deductive, for the most part. And what he's trying to do there is kind of trying to put our own mind into motion so that we can do these things ourselves, so that we can think ourselves, so that we can eventually get towards the actual ethical part. So yeah, I think you can tackle a kind of theoretical problem like that on its own. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, or Spinoza would find something wrong with that. But there's so many times that he does kind of cut something off. He's saying like, this is beside the point. There's a lot of stuff here. I don't need to say all of it. And then so even in the very beginning, I think of the second part, when he talks about the attributes, says, yeah, we basically know two, don't know about the other ones, who cares, we're focused, we want to ultimately understand the human mind, because that's what I'm doing here for ethics. So he has this kind of so one thing, the distinctions of what is going on here is not necessarily, is it really valid? Does it really follow in an absolutely deductive manner? It's kind of like what is really guiding it along with that kind of deductive, kind of the geometric method. Is this the criterion? Is this relevant? Is this really relevant to ethics? And I think that's one of the things where I think you have to kind of see where he gets, even in book 3, book 4, book 5, And then you can see, okay, this is what, this is why these distinctions were kind of, or some things were kind of thrown to the side as irrelevant, or like, this is not what I'm doing. So even in the second part, he says, yeah, so I've always, I'll just say, I've always found this idea that there's infinite attributes, but we only know of two.
There's something about that idea that I just don't really like. I've always been like, what? Come on. You could do something like so
Sci-fi with that, but okay, whatever. I'll go along with it. Two attributes, okay. But then you see that, like, okay, but that's because he wants to focus on the human mind and whatnot. In order to do that, he has to focus on the body. What is a body? And he gives this really, what I think is pretty detailed, very innovative theory of what bodies are.
But then, and then towards the end, he's just like, oh, there's a ton of other stuff I could say about this, but who gives a shit? We're not talking about bodies. We just want to talk about what the human mind is in
order to understand this. And then he just goes on. So I think that's that shows that kind of how he's definitely doing the geometric method, but it is definitely a book of ethics, and that means that it is definitely supposed to be practical and that we apply it. And that means, we go through the motion in our thought along with that geometric method. It also unfolds in our own thinking, puts our own thinking in motion, but also that we apply it in other ways, I think, too.
Yeah, so I think that no, I just wanted to ask, like, this is like when it's talking about like the speculative. I think this is like maybe a problem here. Is it seems that like the style that he's using it's like this I don't know, like kind of like Morean propositional like statements, like propositions. And that like some of these propositions you just like proposition that more like I think that more provided G Moore provided with something about like, oh, the earth is old, it is here longer, but well before me, and it'll be here long after me. If you're an empiricist, right, like you're gonna prostrate yourself over like a stone to prove that the world's going to be here long after you. You literally cannot prove that empirically. So you have to suspend that kind of suspicion, essentially, to even and it's even in like the proposition makes sense. Like it's common. It's like you would be a madman to deny the common sense of that kind of proposition. Not to say that that's what Spinoza's here doing, but that's what Moore is kind of saying. There's certain propositions for which you could just like, you would be a flaming idiot to just insist upon like no, give me the numbers, And so I kind of think that some of those same kind of things translate over to Spinoza here. Spinoza is directly as literally like he's just saying as a basis. He's just like, we're going to take these axioms and we're going to just run with them. And then through running with them, I'll kind of show you how, like the shit works. And then, but like you have to give up, I guess, a particular kind of speculativism, or speculation. And one of those would probably have to be this like question of the infinity that was being provided. I think that's kind of what, like it's propositionally makes sense, and therefore just like cope is like kind of like Spinoza's like response. I think because that's what G.E. Moore would say. G.E. Moore would just say cope butter. Like
he'd also say, I have a hand, I have another hand, therefore reality is real. So look,
yeah, which is
I love
silly.
Moore. I love Moore. He's great, but
But I think of it, and I mean, it may be you can maybe you can couch it in those terms, but I think of it as Spinoza is a classical rationalist, kind of in the tradition of Descartes, and for a rationalist, there are truths you can discover purely through reason, and those are the most important truths that there are. And so that's the way I think of, so his geometric method is teasing out these fundamental truths of reality that are built into the structure of reason, and therefore built into the structure of reality. So, I guess you could call it speculative, but I think fundamentally it's a rationalist project. And, he doesn't deny that there's empirical reality, but these rational truths are the foundation of existence.
Yeah. I think, that's what I'm trying to call into question. I'm like, is this a foundational truth at the bottom of existence? I don't know. But yeah, I won't take any more. I know I've taken up way too much time. As
Chase, be your mic, Chase. Like, I see you frustrating with it right now.
Blah, blah, blah. I don't know what the hell is wrong with this. Oh. No. Okay.
I don't know. Tap the laptop or something.
Very low.
Oh, wait. Try talking now.
Okay. Now?
Oh, shit. It didn't work.
No. God damn it. There's just like one little thing.
Oh, it's working now.
Oh God, what was it? Wait, what was I even gonna say? Oh no.
Geometric system.
Oh, wait.
Arguing in defense of infinity.
Rationalism.
Atheism
Okay, actually, you know
and-
what? I never got to. So Spinoza has some very specific things to say about infinity, and there's different types that I never got to say anything about, even though I admit I don't understand all of them completely. And he had some letter that was specifically about this, where he goes into detail on these types of infinity, which I don't know, maybe good secondary reading, possibly. I don't know.
I'll have to look at it. Yeah.
But one thing I wanted to say, so I've been reading this guidebook. It's Beth Lord's Spinoza's Ethics. And so it's really good. And one of the things that she claims in it on one of the first pages is that
One of the purposes of the book is to show that Spinoza is just as much an empiricist as a rationalist, and that the distinction between those two is, a convenient kind of institutional
thing, but ultimately does not help. And I was like, okay, we'll see. I know he does make some arguments occasionally where he's like, okay, this we know from experience, or from experience we know this is complete, this does not work. But so I'm curious to see exactly what her argument is for that.
The confidence with which he can make synthetic propositions about the nature of God tells me that he's more. I think that the distinction between rationalists and empiricists can be overblown. I think it's a valid distinction, but I think rationalists were not necessarily keeping the knowledge we get from experience way at arm's length. We want nothing to do with that. They prioritized the operation of the rational mind over experience, but experience had its place. And similarly with empiricists, right? They didn't poo-poo the operation of the rational mind separate from experience. They just prioritized and emphasized the content we get through experience. And it's a matter of stress and emphasis. And I can't help but see Spinoza is placing a heavy emphasis on the rational. Although I'll grant he does leave room for the empirical. I still see him as a rationalist. I don't know, maybe this is my prejudice. There are a number of points in here where, you can anticipate that, somebody steeped in Kantian thought is going to bristle. And here also, giving Spinoza credit for synthesizing rationalism and empiricism. I don't see it. I think he makes room for the empirical, but I still see him as a rationalist. Especially, like I said, the point I started with, to make synthetic propositions on the nature of God from your armchair, to me, is a rationalist move.
So I think possibly one. Oh no!
I'm in the sewer again, aren't I?
No, you're back out again.
Okay. So I think one argument to be made, at least in favor of something like a balance between those, is that he's going to stress affect or affections. That's kind of, so some translations have it as emotion, and this kind of bodily dimension of I'm gonna say experience, but that's kind of like begging the question at that point. But yeah, this focus on the body, this focus on affects, that is really important, and I think goes along with that aspect of the mind. It's almost like, that parallelism, I think you could see from that indeed, we can't really separate the workings of the mind and also empirical or embodied existence. And yeah,
I'm just going to put this on the table. I may retract it later. I'm just throwing shit on the wall. But to me, I would grant perhaps Spinoza as a rationalist gives a lot of space for the empirical. And so to me right now, the proposition that Spinoza is an empiricist is about on par with the proposition that Hegel is a materialist. Of all the idealists, Hegel had made a lot of space, carved out space for the material. But he's primarily committed. He says so himself, he's an idealist. But more than Fichte, more than Schelling, he carved out space for the material. And so a dedicated materialist might look back, read all the German idealists and say, well, actually, Hegel was a materialist. Well, compared to the others, possibly. But no, he was an idealist. And so right now, my thinking is, you can look back and read Spinoza and compare him to Descartes and Leibniz and say, well, goodness, he reads like an empiricist. Well, yeah, because you're comparing him to Descartes and Leibniz. But he's still a rationalist. He just, of the rationalists, is the one that carves out the most space for the empirical. And I may change my, I may change as we read, but that's my impression.
I'm recalling, and again, I'm not caught up with y'all. I just got my book yesterday, so I've just kind of dipped into it. But I'm recalling too, like the idea that, Spinoza making the claim that the attributes of like thought and extension are kind of getting at the same thing, and that they're kind of like they're identical, or they're I almost like, and correct me if I'm wrong, I almost see that as like translatable, and almost there's this idea of like I can follow thought and I'm following my body. And I can see him almost like setting up this claim of how he might say that rationalism is necessarily kind of, at least by his logic, connected to kind of what's happening in the world of extension, and thereby, I guess, like trying to connect to experience, the affects, the body.
Yeah, and I think on another level, he's also the way that, so he starts off with definitely that kind of, was it like a first, somebody made the reference to the first philosophy or something, but he's, he starts off that way, but eventually the kind of plane that he puts us on, where we start from, is from that first level of knowledge where we're kind of, immersed in the imagination and all of its affectations with other bodies and whatnot. And that's kind of what we need to eventually kind of combine in all these different ways in order to build up to kind of having some rational ideas. And that doesn't come until quite a bit later. So I think that's another way of saying it. But and that does, I think, go along with how he does see his whole ontology of this kind of, substance, but you've got these two known attributes and they're parallel to each other. But Eric, what you're saying about Hegel as making room for materials, I think that was interesting. So I know someone who argues that Schopenhauer was basically a materialist, and it was kind of preparing the way for a certain kind of materialism that was free from kind of the dialectic abstraction, I guess we can call it. So his idea is that Marx was because he's too, if you invert Hegel, you still get a kind of abstraction. so he's saying that Schopenhauer showed that will, like if you see that as matter, then interesting things follow. So I don't know.
I would argue Schopenhauer is telling us that will is not matter.
I don't think he necessarily is, but yeah.
If it is, it's not matter as it's understood in physics, right? But matter from the inside, which is not as we understand it in the world of physics. I was gonna, okay, so, and you know, time's nearly up, but I am gonna say, because I did betray, like, you know, my Kantian leanings and how, you know, I have a lot of respect here for Spinoza and I want to understand better. But the one thing did, of course, like I said, as you might anticipate, it would bristle. I'm going to point out page 30, right towards the end of our reading, in the middle paragraph. All of these things show sufficiently that each one has judged things according to the disposition of his brain, or rather has accepted affectations of the imagination as things. Just the first part of that. Right? Like, who the hell are you, Spinoza? Do you think that you have accepted things apart from the disposition of your brain? Just, you know what I mean? Again, you might, like, if you understand where I'm coming from. Again, I said who the hell are you? I didn't mean that in a condescending way, right? It's just from a Kantian perspective to say that, oh yeah, these people, the problem is that they could only understand things according to the forms of sensibility that were given to them. Oh, okay. So what forms of sensibility are you operating with?
Blessedness. he's already at the back of the book because he wrote it. I guess.
Again, out of respect, I don't mean to be condescending. It was just that line, you know, I imagine, you know, like I would have
that sounds a whole lot like a ficta statement about when he in the science of knowledge, he's like saying the either choosing dogmatism or transcendentalism is more to do with what the affectations of the philosopher itself, essentially. It smells a whole lot like that. Maybe that was a jibe at Kant himself by, you know, reaching through, you know, he was influenced by Spinoza, but that's what that, I mean, I heard that and I was like, oh, I've seen that elsewhere. Where have I seen that? And that's where it was.
Well, I mean, his claim wants to be that if you think with what do you call it, the intellect, then you're not all confused by all this sensory crap, and you know, which is again a kind of rationalist thing. So, you know, your brain and all that sensory crap, all those emotions and all that stuff just confuses you. So, and that's just all about the imagination. The imagination, it just goes on these bizarre, wild tangents, and just ignore that shit.
Yeah. Again, I can't help but think of the imagination as being an integral piece of the transcendental ego and necessary for any experience whatsoever. But that's my prejudice.
Yeah, so I think Spinoza says the same thing. We have to begin there. And you can't just like eliminate the imagination. It's always there.
But it can't give you adequate knowledge though, right?
Correct. Although we have to use it in order to get to,
okay, well,
reason, which is still kind of still has a bodily correlate, I guess I can call it that.
Okay. Can we rest now?
Transparently.
No resting. More Spinoza.
Oh, resting transparently in the power that created me actually sounds very stressful. At least if you read the rest of that stuff, it's like, oh my God, this doesn't sound relaxing at all.
Just need to
go rest.
Find yourself a river.
That?
Find yourself a river and then swim to the underneath part.
There you go.
You can't remain in the river. You have to get underneath the river. And
underneath.
then you can rest transparently.
Especially if you take a big, deep breath while you're under there, then it's all good.
Evan, when you said that, it reminded me of that old Far Side cartoon where the little kid in the back of the room saying, "Mr. Forrester, can I be excused? My brain is full."
Yes. Yeah, it's too wrinkly. Okay, well, see some of you Monday and hopefully everybody Thursday.
Hey, Eric, before you run away, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Do you mind if I throw you a credit in this response for the Will Smith? I'll throw you because I don't want to. Yeah, I just wondering if you want to have a credit thrown at you.
Okay, sure. Yeah. I mean, do I get to view it just to make sure that it's accurate? You know, like if you're gonna.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say that this idea, this scenario was the product of Eric Crawford's divinely sharp intellect.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll send it over to you.
Yeah,
I paid him X number of dollars for using this idea.
Now I'm curious. Will Smith, what?
I'm gonna head out.
I'll post the response in the Discord. Y'all can look at it there.
That sounds
okay,
good.
cool.
That sounds good.
All right. See y'all later.
I appreciate that.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, of course.
Not only yes, but yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
I'll be safe.